If you've ever been on an airplane that like suddenly drops 100 feet.
Oh, yeah, that terrible stomach drop feeling.
Right, exactly. And you hit this patch of severe, just violent turbulence.
Mm-hmm.
You have probably experienced a very specific kind of, I guess, internal split.
Mm-hmm.
Because, intellectually, your head knows the plane is this absolute marvel of modern engineering. You know it's mathematically designed to handle, like, forces way worse than what you're currently experiencing.
Right, the data and the physics are entirely on your side there.
Yes, statistically speaking, you are incredibly safe. But emotionally...
It's a whole different story.
Oh, entirely. Your heart is pounding out of your chest.
Yeah.
You're gripping that armrest so hard your knuckles are turning white. And in that terrifying, visceral moment, you simply cannot trust the pilot. Like, no matter what the math says.
Yeah, the math doesn't matter when you're terrified.
Exactly. So welcome to the Deep Dive. I'm so glad you're joining us today.
Yeah.
Because today we are looking at that exact split, that gap between the head and the heart, but applied to one of the oldest, heaviest questions in human history, the problem of evil and suffering.
And we are unpacking a really fascinating, deeply philosophical stack of material today, precisely because it acknowledges that split right out of the gate.
Right.
Because, philosophers love to sit in armchairs and debate the logic of evil, the probabilistic arguments, the logical contradictions of, like, a good God and a broken world.
The textbook stuff.
Exactly. But for most people walking around in the real world dealing with grief, the problem of suffering isn't an intellectual puzzle in the head. It's a wound in the heart.
It really is. And look, before we jump into the deep end here,
No.
I want to make something explicitly clear to you, the listener. We are unpacking a pretty heavy architecture of religious and philosophical arguments today concerning Christianity, atheism, and, well, the nature of the universe itself.
It's big stuff.
Very big. But our goal here is absolutely not to take a side, endorse a specific worldview, or, preach to you. We are just acting as your intellectual tour guides today.
Right. Impartial observers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We just want to map out the mechanics of how different philosophies process immense grief so you can understand the landscape of this timeless debate.
And that is a crucial distinction to make, because when we talk about what philosophers call the emotional problem of evil, the core question a sufferer is asking isn't, is a theistic worldview logically rational?
Right.
The actual question is, can I bear to love this God?
Oh, wow. Okay, let's unpack this. Because that exact question, can I bear to love this God, is so perfectly captured in Fyodor Dostoevsky's famous novel, The Brothers Karamazov.
Oh, yeah. Such a classic example.
We see this split between the head and the heart played out so well through the character of Ivan Karamazov.
Yes, Ivan is such a compelling figure for this debate because, Ivan looks around at the horrific suffering in the world, specifically the suffering of innocent children, and his response is incredibly nuanced.
Nuanced how?
Well, he doesn't actually deny that God exists. He doesn't even deny that there might be some ultimate, grand cosmic harmony that eventually justifies all this suffering at the end of time.
He just flat out refuses to accept it.
Precisely. Ivan famously declares that he would rather remain with his unavenged suffering and his unsatisfied indignation, even if he is objectively wrong.
Even if he's wrong. That's so intense.
It really is. He conceptually takes his ticket to the universe and hands it back to the creator. The Christian philosopher William Lane Craig calls this an atheism of rejection.
An atheism of rejection.
Yeah. And what's fascinating here is that Ivan isn't making a logical argument against the existence of God. It is a pure act of will. It's a moral and emotional protest against the terms and conditions of reality.
But wait, I have to push back on Ivan here.
Okay, go for it.
If you intellectually concede that the engineering of the universe might be sound harriedly, that there might actually be a cosmic harmony, isn't returning your ticket inherently irrational? Protesting the turbulence doesn't change the reality of the sky.
That's a fair point.
Right. Like, if the pilot knows what they are doing, refusing to trust them is just self-sabotage, isn't it?
Well, that is exactly the tension. Ivan knows it defies logic, but that is the defining characteristic of the emotional problem of evil.
Because the pain is just too loud.
Exactly. When the pain is acute enough, human beings don't care about the engineering manual. The moral outrage just completely overrides the intellectual calculations.
Which brings up a massive practical dilemma, I think. If the problem is emotional turbulence rather than, intellectual confusion, then throwing intellectual arguments at someone who is actively hurting seems incredibly tone deaf.
Oh, it's terrible.
It's like handing a physics textbook to someone having a panic attack on that dropping airplane.
Right, that's not going to help them breathe.
Exactly. So if theological arguments fail in the face of acute grief, do these philosophical frameworks suggest we just say nothing at all?
Well, historically speaking, yes. Initially, silence and physical presence are exactly what the Christian tradition prescribes as the first line of defense.
Really? Just silence?
Yes. The failure happens when people try to use complex theology as an emotional band-aid. That is a failure of pastoral timing, not necessarily a failure of the theology itself.
Ah, I see. Right, because theology is meant to bear weight, not act as a sedative.
Exactly. Look at the ancient biblical story of Job. Here is a man who loses absolutely everything. I mean, his wealth, his health, his children.
Unimaginable loss.
And his friends come to comfort him. And they are actually at their absolute wisest when they simply sit with him in the dust, weeping in total silence for 7 days. They do the triage perfectly.
Right. It's only when they open their mouths and start trying to intellectually explain why God is doing this that everything goes completely off the rails.
Right. And you see this ethos echoed by the Apostle Paul in the first century, too. He instructs believers not to lecture the grieving, but simply to weep with those who weep. It is all about experiential solidarity.
You know, I was really struck by the Augustine of Hippo example regarding this point in our sources.
Oh, yes. That's a powerful one.
Because Bishop Augustine in the 4th century is like one of the most towering intellects in Western history. But in his autobiography, Confessions, he writes about the sudden death of a very close friend. And he doesn't deploy his massive theological intellect to neatly rationalize the loss. He basically just falls apart. He offers raw, honest, unfiltered anguish.
Which is radical for a philosopher of his era. It validates that the very first proper response to suffering isn't an equation, it's community. It's shared weeping.
But presence is ultimately triage, right? I mean, it stops the immediate bleeding.
Sure.
But eventually the numbness wears off. You wake up one day and you have to figure out how to actually live in a broken world. You start asking the structural questions.
Like, is there hope?
Exactly. Is there hope? Does this mean anything? Can this be redeemed? So when we move from triage to structural repair, how do these different worldviews contrast the actual toolkits they provide?
Well, if we look at the Christian framework first, the central claim that addresses structural repair is the idea that the Creator isn't aloof.
Here's what gets really interesting. Because to use an analogy, it is the difference between a king who sits safely on a high, fortified balcony watching his people suffer from a plague in the slums,
Right.
versus a king who actually leaves the palace, moves into those slums, and experiences the hunger and the disease in his own body.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the doctrine of the Incarnation. The 4th century theologian Athanasius of Alexandria wrote extensively on this.
What was his take?
He argued that God entered physical creation precisely to share in human existence at its absolute lowest, most degraded point. And the philosopher Alvin Plantinga builds on this too. The claim is that God took on a full human nature. God hungered, wept, was betrayed, and bled.
I mean, we really need to pause on how metaphysically massive that claim is.
It's enormous.
We are so used to the cultural idea of it, but philosophically, claiming the prime mover of the universe experienced physical and emotional trauma is wild.
It's a complete paradigm shift, and it all centers on the crucifixion. When Christ is executed and cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It means the divine nature has personally known agony, betrayal, and even the terrifying psychological feeling of divine absence.
So when someone within this framework says, God understands my pain, they aren't just saying God is highly empathetic.
No.
Because empathy is just looking at the telemetry data of the airplane and feeling bad for the passengers. Experiential solidarity is actually sitting in the seat next to them while the plane goes down.
Precisely. But as you said earlier, empathy doesn't fix the broken wing. Experiencing the suffering doesn't automatically repair the universe. That is why the framework hinges entirely on the resurrection.
Right, because without the resurrection, the Incarnation is just a tragic story of a king who moved into the slums and died with his people. Noble, but ultimately helpless.
Exactly. The resurrection is the mechanical foundation of Christian hope because it promises the actual physical restoration of what was lost.
So not just a spiritual thing.
No, not just a vague, disembodied afterlife where we float on clouds, but a promise that the broken world will be rebuilt and redeemed. Furthermore, it points to communion with God as the ultimate goal of human existence.
How does that reframe the actual experience of suffering, though?
Well, William Lane Craig argues that if knowing and loving God is the greatest possible good a human can experience, then suffering can be positively reframed.
Reframed into what?
It isn't good in itself, but it becomes a crucible, a means by which deeper reliance on and knowledge of God is forged.
Wow, it completely flips the script of the courtroom.
It really does.
Because usually human beings act like the prosecutors. We put God on the witness stand, shine a bright light in his eyes, and demand he justify himself for the mess of the world.
Right, the classic framing.
But in this framework, humans become the recipients of grace from a God who voluntarily climbed into the dock and suffered the penalty on their behalf.
Which transforms the fundamental question of the human heart from how can God justify himself to me to how can I be justified before a God who went through that for me?
Okay, so that is the structural logic of the theistic framework.
Yeah.
But we need to examine the alternative. Let's look at the toolkit provided if someone follows Ivan Karamazov's path.
Right, the atheistic framework.
Yeah. If you reject God out of moral outrage at the suffering of the world, what are you actually left with to process that grief?
Well, when you look at atheism purely as a philosophical mechanism for processing grief, it asserts that suffering is a meaningless byproduct of impersonal natural processes.
Because there's no grand designer?
Exactly. Without a creator, there is no overarching narrative arc. A child's suffering isn't a dark chapter in a story moving toward ultimate redemption. It is just a brief, agonizing flickering of consciousness in a cold cosmos, ending in permanent erasure.
And the heavy-hitting atheist philosophers don't shy away from this, do they? They don't try to sugarcoat it.
Not the intellectually honest ones, no. Bertrand Russell famously wrote that the atheist must build their life on the firm foundation of unyielding despair.
Unyielding despair, that's heavy.
And Albert Camus wrote extensively about the inherent absurdity of life. There is a concession of asymmetry here. Atheism offers no final hope, no recompense for the abused, and no ultimate cosmic justice. The universe simply does not care.
But wait, someone listening might say, so what if it's grim? Isn't that just a brutally honest assessment of reality? I'm an atheist, and I absolutely believe the suffering of a child is objectively, morally wrong, even without a God.
Right, that's a very common response.
So what does this all mean for Ivan Karamazov's outrage?
Well, of course, an atheist can feel deep moral outrage, but if we connect this to the bigger picture, a fascinating paradox emerges.
A paradox?
Yeah. William Lane Craig points out that to sustain genuine moral outrage, you need an objective moral standard.
Right. To say that suffering ought not to happen, you have to believe there's an invisible law dictating how things ought to be.
Exactly. But on a purely materialistic, atheistic worldview, what we call evil is merely the way atoms and matter happen to interact in an indifferent universe.
Okay.
Think about a hurricane knocking over a tree and crushing a house. We don't put the hurricane on trial. We don't say the hurricane was morally evil. It's just physics doing what physics does.
Okay, I see where this is going.
If human beings are just biological machines, just complex physics, then one human harming another or a disease taking a child is no more morally wrong than the hurricane.
That's just nature.
Right, it is tragic, yes. But it isn't a violation of a cosmic moral law because no such law exists. Therefore, when the atheist appeals to the profound objective wrongness of suffering, they are actually borrowing a moral standard from the theistic framework in order to indict that very same theistic framework.
Wow. You can't return a ticket unless you assume someone actually issued it in the first place. So you're saying atheism cannot consistently sustain the very moral outrage that grounds the emotional problem of evil to begin with.
Precisely. From a purely structural standpoint, adopting atheism to solve the emotional problem of evil doesn't resolve the grief. It actually strips the grief of its moral foundation and makes the meaninglessness permanent.
Now, I can hear the skeptical gears turning for a listener right now.
Oh, I'm sure.
They might be thinking, okay, fine, atheism is bleak, but what about other philosophies? Or what about the idea that this whole Christian framework is just a comforting fairy tale we invented because we are terrified of the dark?
Those are two very different but important challenges.
Let's tackle alternative coping strategies first. What about something like Stoicism?
Well, it is vital to distinguish between a coping strategy and a genuine resource. Philosophies like Stoicism, Buddhism, or certain strands of existentialism offer brilliant ways to internally adjust your own psychological response to suffering.
How so?
Stoicism, for example, teaches you to accept permanent loss as an inevitable part of the natural order. You detach your emotions from the things you cannot control.
You essentially brace yourself for impact. You lower your expectations of reality so you don't get hurt when reality breaks your heart.
Yes, you cultivate a dignified resignation. But Christianity operates in a categorically different lane because it promises the loss isn't permanent. Look at the historical contrast.
What do you mean?
Well, you have the Stoics' quiet resignation on one hand. On the other, you have early Christian martyrs like Ignatius of Antioch.
Tell us about Ignatius.
He was facing brutal execution in the Roman Colosseum around the year 110 AD, and historical accounts show he didn't exhibit Stoic detachment. He exhibited an inexplicable, vibrant joy and eagerness that completely puzzled the Romans.
Wait, joy, facing execution.
Yeah. It wasn't just him gritting his teeth and enduring it. It was a joyful anticipation based on his absolute conviction that Christ had already conquered death and that his suffering was merely a doorway to resurrection.
But this leads right into the biggest, sharpest pushback, the Freudian wish fulfillment argument.
Ah, yes.
Let's say I haven't eaten in 3 days. I am starving. I really, really wish I had a sandwich. Does my deep, agonizing desire for a sandwich magically mean the universe is going to conjure one for me?
No, it doesn't.
Right. So isn't this entire theological framework just a cosmic security blanket? Like we project a loving God onto the universe because we are terrified of the turbulence.
It is arguably the most common modern objection.
Yeah.
But the philosopher Alvin Plantinga counters this by introducing what he calls the psychogenetic fallacy.
The psychogenetic fallacy. Okay, break the mechanism of that down for us.
The psychogenetic fallacy is the mistake of confusing the origin of a belief with the truth of a belief.
Okay.
Explaining why someone desperately wants to believe something doesn't actually prove the belief is objectively false. To use your analogy, the fact that you are desperate for a sandwich doesn't magically prove sandwiches don't exist.
Right. If I'm terrified of the dark and I desperately want my dad to be in the room, that psychological need doesn't mean my dad isn't standing right there.
Yeah.
You still have to turn on the light and check the physical evidence.
Exactly. Furthermore, Plantinga points out that this psychological knife cuts both ways.
What do you mean?
If the desire for ultimate meaning, justice, and reunion with loved ones explains the psychological appeal of Christianity, what explains the appeal of atheism?
Oh, that's interesting.
Plantinga argues that the desire for absolute autonomy, freedom from ultimate moral accountability, and a deep-seated wish to not be judged by a cosmic creator could equally explain why someone desperately wants atheism to be true.
Oh, wow. You could argue atheism is wish fulfillment for those who want to be the ultimate captain of their own soul, answering to no one.
Precisely. And the C.S. Lewis takes this a step further in his book, Mere Christianity. He addresses your sandwich analogy directly. Well, not with sandwiches, but Lewis argues that the existence of hunger in a human being doesn't logically prove that you, right now, have bread in your hand. But the biological fact that humans universally experience hunger highly suggests that we live in a universe where such a thing as food exists.
So the human longing isn't proof that we get what we want, but proof of the category.
Yeah.
A duck has the instinct to swim because water exists.
Yes. The universal human cry for ultimate justice, meaning, and the restoration of broken things is uniquely matched by the Christian framework. Lewis suggests this match isn't proof that we invented a fairy tale, but rather evidence that the human soul is reacting to the reality of the universe it was designed for.
Okay, but we have to throw the final, heaviest pushback at this framework.
Let's hear it.
If we are talking about a loving God who restores the world, what about the doctrine of hell?
Ah, yes.
How on earth is that a comforting resource for someone in pain?
Yeah.
Doesn't the idea of eternal punishment completely undermine the entire argument of a deeply empathetic, loving God?
This raises an incredibly important question, and the philosophical framework does not shy away from it. But it requires unmasking the cartoonish, medieval pitchforks people usually imagine when they hear the word hell.
Okay, so what is it then?
The framework unpacks a much more nuanced, frankly terrifying respect for human agency.
How so?
C.S. Lewis tackles this in his book, The Problem of Pain. He famously states that the doors of hell are locked on the inside.
Locked on the inside, meaning the person in hell is actively choosing to be there.
Yes. The argument is that hell is not arbitrary divine cruelty or a torture chamber God gleefully throws people into. Instead, it is God's ultimate tragic respect for human free will.
Respect for free will.
Yes. If God is fundamentally defined as love, and genuine love inherently requires free choice, then God must allow conscious creatures the freedom to persistently finally refuse to be reconciled to him.
So it's Ivan Karamazov permanently returning his ticket.
Exactly. Hell is presented as the tragic, freely chosen end of those who absolutely refuse to surrender to God's love. God says, "Thy will be done." And interestingly, we have to compare this to the alternative. If the modern worry is that eternal separation is a horrific fate, we have to look at what atheism offers.
Which is annihilation. Total erasure of consciousness.
Right. Atheism applies that exact eternal erasure to everyone. Every single person, whether they were a saint or a monster, ceases to exist forever.
That's a bleak comparison.
So structurally speaking, a worldview that offers eternal life and joy to those who want it, while honoring the tragic choice of those who refuse it, is still mathematically and structurally more hopeful than a worldview that enforces eternal erasure on absolutely everyone, regardless of what they want.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. I mean, we started with the visceral emotional terror of the dropping airplane, that turbulence of suffering that makes us want to return our ticket to the universe.
We really did.
We looked at how the historical tradition prioritizes silent physical presence over philosophy in the acute moments of triage. We explored the astonishing theistic claim of a God who steps into the slums, who bleeds on the cross in experiential solidarity, and promises ultimate physical restoration.
And we examined the atheistic alternative, too.
Right. The profound paradox that atheism, while attempting to honor the moral outrage of suffering, actually strips that outrage of its foundation. Ultimately, the architecture we've explored today reframes the emotional problem of evil not as a reason to abandon theism, but as the very reason a human heart might desperately need to seek it out.
It really is a comprehensive, radical reframing of how to look at pain. But looking over all the mechanics of these arguments, there's one final thought that I think lingers just beyond the philosophy itself.
What's that?
Something for you, the listener, to mull over long after this deep dive ends. The historical frameworks emphasize so heavily that the very first, most vital response to the emotional problem of evil is physical presence.
Like Job's friends.
Right. Job's friends sitting in the dust. The Apostle Paul commanding us to weep with those who weep. That kind of triage requires profound physical proximity.
Deep community as the ultimate first line of defense.
Exactly. So what happens to our capacity to endure suffering in a modern, hyper-digital society?
Oh, man.
We are more connected by glowing screens than any humans in history, yet we are increasingly isolated from deep, physical, geographical community.
That is so true.
If the deepest answer to the emotional problem of evil genuinely begins with human presence, regardless of what worldview you happen to hold, are we losing the very first tool required to survive grief?
Wow. When the severe turbulence hits and the plane drops, there might not actually be anyone sitting in the seat next to you to hold your hand.
It's a sobering thought.
That is a heavy, essential question to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.